Good afternoon, everyone. We're glad to have you with us for this Tuesday for Teachers webinar developed by the GED Testing Service. And today we're going to be talking about teaching social studies through political cartoons. Political cartoons seem to be an area which students often struggle. So hopefully we can combine two things here. One, helping students become better at interpreting political cartoons, but at the same time, helping them to learn some of those fundamental concepts that are in social studies that our students really need to know. So we are very glad to have you with us today. My name is Susan Pittman. I'm a professional development consulting working with the GED Testing Service. Normally, Debbie Fawcett would be with us, but she is on the road today, so she will not be here. But we are so glad to have you with us. And we do have people from all over the country who have come into the webinar, from Washington to Florida to Texas and Virginia, all throughout the country, Colorado, many of you different places. So today what we're going to do is we're going to explore the basic elements of political cartoons. We are going to explore the role that those cartoons have played throughout U.S. history. And we're going to take a look at some strategies and activities that you can use to help students learn how to interpret cartoons and learn some background knowledge at the same time. And of course, as always, with any of our Tuesday for Teachers webinars, we'll be sharing some resources with you as well. So let's get started. Remember when? Well, this may not be ancient history. However, it is something that our students may look at, many of them, and go, what is that? And why do you need a pencil? Well, for those of us who remember, that's a compact cassette. And of course, we've all had those situations where all that tape started coming out of the cassette and you're like, oh, don't let it break. And what did you do? You grabbed a pencil and you used that in order to wind that tape back in there. Now, what else can we see from this? What other types of technology would you see maybe a little bit before this? 8-track tapes. Yes, they didn't last long, but they were very popular there for a while. And of course, before that, if you wanted to hear music, you got out the record player and you had those 45s and 33s and 78s that you could use on that. This is a way that you can start, students, with political cartoons or just cartoons in general. Although this is not making a big statement from a political issue standpoint, what we do in looking at this is to get students to begin to take in all the details that are included there and talk about things like, what did we do before we had CDs and DVDs and we had iTunes and all the other things that are available to us today? Start with things that are current. But before we get into political cartoons specifically, let's back up just a little bit and take a look at how we need to focus our social studies instruction. What are some things that we can do to make sure that our students learn what they need to learn? So take a look at this quote from Thomas Jefferson. He says he agrees with you that it's the duty of every good citizen to preserve documents relating to the history of our country. Well, quite often when we think of that, we think of those big documents, the Declaration of Independence, or we look at the Constitution. But political cartoons are documents just as well. They document the things that were going on at that point in time and related to history. And political cartoons, they've been around for a long time. They're not a new invention by any means. So what should you teach when it comes to social studies? Well, you have two different areas that you really need to think about in working with this. One, there's the content specifically, and that's focusing things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And then the other side of that, we have those high impact indicators or practices that our students need. Now, when all is said and done, our students have to utilize their reading skills, but it does help if they have some understanding of the big ideas of our civics and government or U.S. history, not the little details, but the big ideas, because we want our students to be able to analyze and evaluate what they're reading or what they're looking at, if it may be a graphic, political cartoon, because we need them to create meaning and understanding so that they can go on and do that into the future. So let's talk a little bit about the development of modern liberties and democracies. That's just one of two things under which all the questions can flow on the GED test. So when we're looking at that development, we're talking about what do some of the more modern governments look like? How is our U.S. government structured? How is it designed? We can look at those key historical documents, going back again, talking about the Declaration of Independence, and also taking a look at the Declaration of Independence, looking at the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, those types of things. But we can go a little bit further within that. How did our economy change, and how does it help shape American government and our policies that we have? Things changed after the Depression in the 1920s. Government policies were impacted by the Great Depression itself. And there's Geography and World, which really looks at some of the more classical civilizations. Now, turning to the next one, dynamic responses in societal systems. That sounds like some pretty fancy terms, but really it's looking at how things changed based on some of the big events that were out there. How did we move from isolationism prior to World War II and the war machine that led us to victory against the Germans and the Japanese? And also, how did the economy, how was that impacted by World War II itself? Well, I can tell you that prior to World War II, unemployment was pretty high in the U.S. But when that war machine ramped up, there was basically zero unemployment. And that's where we look at how things change in our economy. Who was working? We've all seen the posters of Rosie the Riveter and how women were involved in occupations that before then really weren't open to them. And last but not least, we've looked at how people began to move from one place to another, from one area of the world to another, and how borders changed as a result of the changes after World War II. So you can look at this as how we change based on things that are happening within society, but also we look at that modern liberties and democracy. So I see some key things here that students can really focus on. Take a look here, because we actually have civics and government and U.S. history are almost 70% of the test. If we can work in those areas, that can make a difference for our students. Now let's think about critical thinking skills. When it comes to working with our political cartoons, our students are going to need some of these skills. Making inferences and drawing conclusions, key factor in being able to interpret a cartoon itself. Interpreting the meaning of symbols. Cartoons are rich with symbols, and they represent a point of view, the point of view of the cartoonist. So what is the purpose? What is the cartoonist trying to do with what he has drawn, what he is representing? And we look at relationships among the different players within a cartoon itself. How is that interaction occurring? One other thing to keep in mind, although we won't be doing that in this particular webinar, remember that in social studies, there's other graphics that students need to be familiar with, including photographs, charts, maps, timelines, all of those. So keep that in mind as we're working through this. Just a couple things here with the high impact indicators. And when you take a look at this second one, we really want to see how that interaction, the connection between people and places and events that occurred, because those can show up quite a bit in setting that historical context for the political cartoonist. We look at cause and effect, and all of these things, most things don't happen in isolation. There are multiple things that are going on. The next one is so important to our students, and this is where we have to begin to dig a little deeper into different times in history, because the historical context really shapes, in this case, the cartoonist point of view, just as it does if you have an author who is writing some type of text. When they're writing it, the events that were going on make a difference in how that is portrayed. So let's take a little deeper dive into political cartoons, and let's look at what that cartoonist is actually doing. So we start with the tools of the cartoonist. There are 5 main elements that cartoonists use to convey their point of view. And we recognize these really well when we get into symbolism, where we use an object to stand for an idea. We're all used to seeing Uncle Sam, or we see the Statue of Liberty to represent freedom. But also a cartoonist uses captions and labels. Sometimes their words are needed within the cartoon to draw emphasis to what they're trying to portray. We have the analogy where we're comparing two unlike things, but they've got some similar characteristics. And then, of course, where would the political cartoonist be without irony? Where we're looking at how things are versus the way that they should be or might be expected to be. And of course, we have exaggeration, where the cartoonist goes in and magnifies a problem or a physical feature. Politicians, they're portrayed in lots of different ways when it comes to political cartoons. So let's take a look at the cartoons we have on this page. Up here, what do we see? Well, we have a big sign here saying, "Caution, children playing." And of course, looks like a playground to me in the background, where we have the swings and the basketball court. But where are the children playing? They're all absorbed in their technology. And in fact, they're not even looking at each other. So there we see irony, where you expect to see children playing. They're playing, but they're playing with something different. And then we look at symbolism. Looking at this, we know about the battles that were in the Pacific, and we see that raising of the flag at Iwo Jima and that battle for freedom that was involved in that. And then, of course, we have an analogy. Forrest Gump said it best: life is like a box of chocolates. And so you don't know what you're going to get until you open up that box and take that first bite. So we have that analogy. And last but not least, Richard Nixon was always portrayed during his presidency and even before then with that long, big nose that was in there. If you think about it, Barack Obama, throughout his presidency, they always portrayed him within political cartoons with large ears. So those are set aside as they work with different characters. So take a look at each of these cartoons, and this may be something you want to do with students. We provided a copy of this so that you can actually use it in the classroom. So what is the cartoonist doing? Well, in this first one, it's certainly symbolism. We have the donkey representing the Democrats. We have the elephant representing the Grand Old Party or the Republicans. And our students need to be familiar with those symbols and other ones as well. We have exaggeration and distortion. We've all heard recent talks about the, literally billions and billions of dollars that are tied up in student loan debt, and what a problem that is. And we notice here the cartoonist has exaggerated that ball and chain that's around the person's ankle to show how that really drags someone down. So we see the exaggeration here on the student loan debt. And then, of course, we all know the stereotypes that we see. We see the lobbyist from Washington, or we maybe see the rich person, complete with the fancy clothes and the golden watch and the big cigar. And then caricature. Cartoonists often use that so they can make you think a little bit more. Look at this man who has a lot of fear and prejudice, and he's concerned about the enemy that's out there. And of course, the mirror says, know your enemy. And what's reflected? It's reflected back on himself. And then, of course, humor and irony. And I have a feeling this cartoon will get a lot of views as we start moving into 2020 with the elections. It's, the end is near. Good. I can't wait for this election to be over. So all of these things, are things that our students need to be familiar with as they start to work with those political cartoons. We know that, yes, students are failing history. They're not learning the history that they should know, and more about their government as well. But yet the student will turn around and say, but Mom, I do know my history. To prove it, I'll Google Abe Lincoln. Well, and that pretty much brings up a good point for our students. And many of our students say, well, why should I memorize? And why do I need to understand all this stuff when I can just look it up? Well, we're not looking for students to memorize. We want them to have an understanding of the big ideas in civics and government, the big ideas in U.S. history, so that they don't always have to depend on Google in order to find something. So let's shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the history of political cartoons. And you have to understand that these began way back in the early 1700s, and it really was a street level phenomenon. It was something that could be posted on a wall, it was passed around from one person to another, and it was really a way to spread political ideas. It became so popular, in fact, that newspapers and magazines depended on those cartoons as a way to help sell their product. But it did something for cartoonists. It allowed them a way to express their opinions. And sometimes that was to praise something that was going on. Other times it was to attack things that were going on. So let's look at the first political cartoon here. Notice the date, May 9th, 1754. This is well before we had a Declaration of Independence, well before there was a Constitution. Benjamin Franklin for the Pennsylvania Gazette created this particular one, and it was all about emphasizing the importance of what was then the Albany Plan of Union. And the idea was to get a central government within those 13 colonies. And so what you see is the snake is cut into 8 parts. And that's to symbolize each of the colonies along the American coast. The goal was to point out the dangers that were inherent if you didn't have some type of colonial unity. The united we stand, divided we fall type of attitude. The Albany Plan actually was approved in July of 1754. it just never was implemented. But it was important because it was that first take on how governments could work together to look at a centralized government. So a couple of things as we go through and as you're working with political cartoons and with your students. You have to emphasize that they're expressions of opinion. That individual cartoonist is letting people know his or her point of view. What is that opinion they have about a specific issue or an event? It's really designed to use emotional appeal and help try to persuade others to accept that opinion. So they're bringing in, tugging at the emotions to get people to say, oh, this is right. This is correct. They're not evidence of the way things were or the way everyone else felt about them. They're not considered to be evidence. Again, their opinion. And keep in mind, because this is an individual's point of view, they are often heavily biased. So students need to recognize, and this is a good way to introduce them to bias so that they can begin to understand what is the difference between an opinion and actual evidence that supports a specific idea or issue. And they require students to make inferences. So one resource I would recommend to everyone is from teachinghistory.org. If you, later on, you download the materials from GED.com website, you'll be able to go in, access this particular URL, and pull down the materials and have excellent materials on political cartoons and teaching history through those political cartoons. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that as students are approaching political cartoons, that they're asking some specific questions. First one, what conditions might have given rise to this cartoon? So what was going on around the cartoonist at that point in time? And who is the cartoonist trying to appeal to? There may be some very specific people that cartoonist is reaching out to and trying to convince them of how to change what they're thinking, or maybe it's actually pointing toward those who believe in the same way. And the other one deals with values, and it's what is that cartoonist trying to express, either just overtly, it's just right there on the page, or is implying. So those are questions that students need to be asking. And so as you start to work with students on political cartoons, keep in mind that you will need to walk them through that process, and you'll need to ask those questions and see how students respond, or that you are asking and answering those specific questions. This is a timeline that I created through Read, Write, Think. Excellent website, number one, for all the resources that are there. But I love the fact that they have a timeline creator. Our students don't have a lot of practice working with timelines, but this is something where I just looked into a number of different resources like the National Archives and the Library of Congress to match up the time frame and specific issues that were happening throughout American history that then we could work on as a group in the classroom. So you may want to create your own, and maybe you don't want to use as many things as I have here. Again, I think it's always good to include that very first cartoon, but also hit some of the issues that our students need to understand a little better. The whole concept of gerrymandering. It's very much in the news today, and it impacts everyone in terms of their ability to vote. So that's a really good one. You could look at women's right to vote in 1919 and look at it from a standpoint of how the Constitution was amended over time. that this women's right to vote wasn't there from the beginning. You could look at how sometimes, for example, with Prohibition, an amendment comes in, but really wasn't the right thing to do. So it's taken back out. But you can also use that cartoon and the timeline itself to show more recent events. For example, never forget, referring to 9/11. Lincoln wept, which was at the time of JFK's assassination. So this is an opportunity for you to pull in some things that represent big ideas that are going on within the country itself. But again, as I said, Read, Write, Think from the International Reading Association and the National Council for Teachers of English have put together this wonderful timeline creator. And you can create timelines for lots of different things. So, as we were talking a little bit earlier, talked about the fact that, civics and government is 50% of the test. I mean, that's where the focus is. So why don't we use cartoons in order to address some of those issues? The National Archives has done a tremendous service in putting together different cartoons that match up to different parts of the Constitution itself. They actually have a Constitution scavenger hunt that comes from using political cartoons. So this is not one of them, but this one can be a starting point. From this, we could actually have students look and say, okay, what is this? What are these symbols of? Well, we are used to seeing the white hair with the rolls on it, the fancy dress with all the ruffles and frills, and representing the founding fathers. And what are they talking about? Well, we should probably guarantee free speech at some point. Well, where does free speech come from? Well, that's in the Bill of Rights. In fact, that's in the first one. So then we take a look at, would that cover editorial cartoons? Oh, come on, is that really necessary? I hate the way they draw my nose. So we're actually pulling in a little bit of government here and talking about the Bill of Rights and rights that are guaranteed. We're talking about what all does that cover? It's not just about, when you make a speech or you're talking, but also editorial cartoons are also another form of speech. And of course, you can talk about the way that the cartoonist uses exaggeration when they're drawing things to represent different people. But let's do a little test. Test your knowledge. This is actually from the National Archives. And what they've done is they have gathered political cartoons together, and they're associated with different clauses in the Constitution. Now, no one expects students to know what each clause is, those individuals, and can say, well, this is Article 1 and it's Section B and so on. What we really want to do is know, what's the big idea behind it? What is that? What is this cartoon representing? So let's take a look at the first one. As you look at this one, you'll see that you have people yucking it up. You have the bull moves, and it goes back into the actual election at that point in time. But notice the word here. Remember how we talked about captions and, where they had different labels? So we have electoral votes. This provides an opportunity for students to talk about the Electoral College. Students hear about it, but they don't know what it is. Who serves on it? Where is it located? What's the meaning of it? Students need to understand that for presidential elections, you have electors. And those electors are the ones who actually vote in the final tally for the president. And that's based on whether or not a person wins a state's popular vote. So as you take a look, we've had Al Gore, who won the popular vote, but didn't win the Electoral College. The same thing happened with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. One won the popular vote, the other one, the Electoral College. So this is an opportunity to talk to students about the importance of voting and in every election. They all have a voice. It's up to them to be able to use that voice. Now, take a look at this cartoon and take a look at all the details. Looks like we have a snake right here. And it says we have, or maybe it was going to be a rat with a long tail. We have the OPA bill. We have the word veto, and then we have Truman. Here's our opportunity to work with students and talk to them about the veto power that is granted to the executive branch, to the president specifically, over legislation that comes out of Congress. So we want to talk about not just the veto, but how is it that if there's an overwhelming response, that veto can be overridden. So key words for students, as well as taking a look at those concepts that students need. Let's take a look at another one. Here we have Truman again. Read it and weep. And you have Congress, represented by this person whose eyes are open really big in surprise. And here's this huge book. It's the State of the Union and the State of the Budget in 25,000 words. Now, a couple of things you can work with from here. Every year, the president is asked to present the State of the Union. And we have now the big televised event. But at one point in time, it was really a report that was sent over to Congress. Now, it's a big opportunity for everyone to be together and hear ideas and things that have happened, but also the president's vision looking into the future. Now, one other thing, we see the word budget and we see Congress. This also talks about in Article 1 of the Constitution, who is responsible for putting together that budget? Who actually allocates and approves the funds? And what happens at that point in time? So our students need to begin to understand the three branches of government and how each of them works and who's responsible for what. Very important as they're working within this. About time to measure yourself again. And you have the House. You have a representation of Uncle Sam. And it says the 14th census, 105,708,771. So what does that mean, measure yourself again? Well, it's actually looking at the requirement within the Constitution that there be a census conducted every 10 years. And that census makes some determinations. For our students, they need to understand that's how you determine how many representatives a state will have. So students may think, well, that's not such a big deal. It is, because that makes a determination on your representation in Congress. But beyond that, that census also provides information where funds may be allocated to different areas because of the population that they have. This is a good time to talk with students about what the census does and what it doesn't do. And so that everyone, because it's so important that everyone participate in the census. And we have one coming right around the corner in 2020. Our next cartoon would be a little different if it were done today as opposed to back in the, like 1940s, I believe is when this one first came out. But you see the justices with their big books coming walking into the Supreme Court. So this gives you a chance to talk with students about this branch of government and what it does, the judicial branch. Now, if this cartoon were recreated today, you would see people of color, people of different ethnicities, but also different genders. No longer is it just all men sitting on the Supreme Court. Things have changed over time. Now, that was just a few examples from the constitutional scavenger hunt. We're going to provide you with access to the rest of it because it has even more cartoons to give you a chance to really get students to be familiar with the Constitution and what it lays out for all of us. But there's some other connections. There's connections between political cartoons and our lives. We have the saying from George Santayana, who says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And if you think for a minute, we have seen that happen. In fact, it's not that very long ago. In 1929, there was this thing called the Great Depression. And there was no money. The stock market crashed. People had to run on the banks, and the banks didn't have the money to cover what people had in there, to cover their savings. People lost their homes, or, you had the Dust Bowl where people had to just leave. They had to evacuate. All the furniture is also there to be sold. History repeated itself in 2008. We didn't have a Great Depression, we had a Great Recession. But if you take a look, people are standing in line at the bank. The headlines talk about the crash, and lots of homes were either up for foreclosure or they were being sold. Now, there's no political cartoon here, but these images, those photographs, are another thing that our students need to be familiar with as they're moving in to take this test. But if you want to see it from the standpoint of a political cartoonist, this was from 2008 from the Denver Post. And you'll see there's Uncle Sam saying, you'll be pleased to know that technically we're not in a recession. Well, I don't think the family quite feels that way. And you could, at that point in time, talk about all the things that were having an impact on families and individuals in 2008. That's recent enough that most of our students can have some memory of all the issues that occurred during that point in time. So let's take a look at something from a little earlier, 1935. And there's poor taxpayers, and they're being crushed by taxes and greedy politicians. And so they're under this great stress as they're going through, just as the family over here under the stress from all the things that are occurring. So let's take another look. I mentioned earlier, in fact, one of the cartoons, about gerrymandering. It's a big issue today. In fact, it's gone to the Supreme Court, and the court basically said it needs to be a decision of the state. And so now in many states, you actually have the higher courts within the states who are having to make decisions about the different districts and how they're laid out. I live in North Carolina, and this is an example of just one congressional district. And it weaves its way from Durham through Greensboro, High Point, even up to Winston-Salem, and then finally lands in Charlotte. But I don't think that quite holds candle to, in Louisiana, the Congressional District 4, which starts all the way up in Shreveport, makes its way all the way down into Baton Rouge and over into Lafayette. These are what we call gerrymandered districts. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I think this cartoon says it best. And this again, 2016, we're your elected officials. Exactly. We elected you to be our voters. So in this case, you have elected officials who are drawing maps so that they can get the voters that will bring them back to office again. History's repeating itself because the same thing happened in 1812. And that's where we first saw the gerrymander. And this was Essex South District formed into a monster. And you can see the claws and the teeth, all of those things where this was gerrymandered in order to ensure that a certain politician was elected. So gerrymandering, not a new thing, one that we keep working with. So you've probably seen or heard something about wage inequality, and especially between men and women, that two people doing the same job, a woman will typically earn less money. Now, there's lots of variations within that, and it's how you define the same type of job. So in this cartoon, we have a guy with equal pay bill, and he says, another day, another dollar. The woman says, another day, another 77 cents. That particular cartoon is from 2019, where in different parts of the country, there is a big difference between the salaries between men and women. However, we can take this cartoon, and this comes from 1999, 20 years ago. Well, as the fellows don't say, another day, another 75 cents. So the same issue being repeated at different points in time. And how do you address those difficult issues? I imagine, if you're like me, you have probably heard everything you want to hear about the swamp. You've heard, drain the swamp, drain the swamp. Well, what do they mean? And for our students, it really does come down to, what are you talking about? Well, in this particular case, and this is the more recent one, you have the lobbies who are sending money over to politicians, the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So they say, finally, we've done it. America strongly worded, bipartisan lip service to put the lobbies on notice. Notice how the cartoonist is not just using symbols, but using words to get the point across. And we have the new Senate bill to limit gifts from registered lobbyists. And you'll notice that that bill is written on toilet paper. In other words, it's not really what it needs to be. But is the swamp new? No. Back in that era of Prohibition, that brief time while Prohibition was in place, there was a lot of what we called at that time graft, where all these different politicians and agents and people from different government agencies all had their hand out so that they would turn their back and not notice that certain people were making alcohol, selling alcohol, running alcohol from places to place. So it's the same type of thing that we have for both of these. So last but not least within this is, let's just take a little bit of how can we help our students really dig deeper into a political cartoon? How can we get them to the point where they understand, they are looking at the details, and they're able to get that deeper meaning out of it? The National Archives, again, an incredible resource, but they've developed two different graphic organizers for analyzing cartoons. This first one, is titled For the Novice, and it's actually a little simpler than the next one, but this one is your opportunity to actually take students and take a deep dive into a cartoon itself. What do you see? Is the cartoon black and white or is it in color? Is there a caption? What does the caption tell you? If you notice in the middle column, it's asking about the people, the objects, the symbols. And then the student is asked to write 2 words that describe the cartoon. And then you move over to the last column where you're looking at trying to make sense of it. What does a symbol stand for? Who drew it? When was it drawn? And then coming up to the main idea. Those are things that really let students analyze the cartoon itself, break it down into those finer details, and for them to really pay attention to it. From there, students can move into this one, which a little bit more complex. It's not quite going individual pieces as much. They're looking at words versus visuals. What do those visuals stand for? You know, what was happening at the time it was created, and what's the message? So, and also an opportunity for students to, what's the evidence from your cartoon that led to your conclusion? Remember back early on, we talked about the fact students need to be able to draw conclusions and make inferences. So this graphic organizer allows students to be able to do that. One more cartoon. Take a look at that cartoon. Notice the date, March 17, 1965, and the label says it's a literacy test. So what is this person reading? Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. This particular cartoon is an excellent cartoon to use in helping students understand the Voting Rights Act, what was happening with civil rights during this particular time frame, and that real fight to get rights for African Americans to be able to vote without having to pay a tax, without having to pass some fancy literacy test, and understanding that citizens in this country have the right to vote, and it should not be denied for any reason. So a good way to work students through that process and the importance of their own votes. You may have students who are not registered to vote. Help them understand they have a voice. It's just up to them whether or not they choose to use it. So on a final note, we'll come back to a more humorous one here. Well, gentlemen, that wraps it up. Are we forgetting anybody? Well, in this particular case, we see the Constitution, and we notice and we think about what did that Constitution represent at that time. It said all men are created equal. Men. Didn't mention women. And it did reference very specific groups of men at that point in time. However, keep in mind too that Constitution has been something that over time has allowed this country to grow and change so that equal means something different than it did back in the days when it was first written. So what can you do? There are a couple of things. I would recommend starting with cartoons from your hometown paper. Talk about current issues. Maybe there's something that's going on with the school board or some other issue that is close to home. Consider doing a cartoon of the day. Once you have gone through and you have modeled for students how to work with cartoons, you've begun to address certain issues, provide a copy of a cartoon, have students analyze that cartoon, and then just set that aside. And at a specific time during your class, have everyone discuss that cartoon. See where the challenges are. See where you may need to address some type of issue, or you may need to talk about some points within history that they just don't understand, or they just don't have not been exposed to. Consider using the Constitutional Scavenger Hunt from the National Archives. Excellent resource. I think your students will learn a lot from that. I know I did, just having a chance to go through it. And then always provide some time to help build students' understanding of historical events. One of our attendees for this particular webinar actually recommended consider including what happened today in history. You have history.com has wonderful resources that you can take a look at to have that this day in history and what happened and events that occurred throughout different time frames. So one more thing that we want to share with you are just some resources. I've spoken several times about the National Archives. If you go into the National Archives, you can do a search for the Constitution Scavenger Hunt. If you don't have access to this URL, it will take you right to the page and you can see these different types of materials available. We just used a few cartoons. There are 16 political cartoons that are included. And if you want to get some cartoons that are all about current issues, go to Kegel Cartoons, which is at kegel.com. Daryl Kegel is a political cartoonist. He has, on this site, there are about 60 different cartoonists who publish their work. Keep in mind that you may come up against, you will definitely come up against things that have a bias. You will come up with things that could be controversial, but take a look and see at the different cartoons that are included. Docsteach is one of my favorite, and this is from the National Archives, but it's a little different section from it. It's an online tool for teaching with documents. I recommend this for so many different things. There are things that you can talk about different eras within history itself, but also there's so many wonderful photographs and portraits and different things that you can use to help students increase their knowledge. And then don't forget the Library of Congress. They have an excellent set of lesson plans and political cartoons, wonderful information that you can use, and that's at the Library of Congress. So at this point in time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank all of you for being with us. We appreciate teachers and other adult educators who take time from their busy schedules to join us on the Tuesdays for Teachers. We appreciate those who can't always be with us live, but they actually access the archives on GED.com. So we look forward to you being able to join us again. Our last webinar, Tuesdays for Teachers webinar, will be on December the 10th from 3:30 until 5. We will have a description out very soon so you can register for that webinar. Our focus is going to be kind of a wrap up for the year, but we're also going to, at your request, provide you with some information on resources for the GED that you can find that are in Spanish. So we will be talking about those types of things, as well as always taking your questions and providing the best answers that we can. On behalf of the GED Testing Service and me personally, I really want to thank you for being with me today, to your interest in learning more about how you can help prepare your students. We look forward to seeing you on December 10th. Thank you.